It was a late September weekend, and Aaron was out on yet another reservist training exercise. Nothing special, just the usual land navigation drills in the Virginia countryside. He and the rest of the squad were supposed to be honing their compass and map skills, getting familiar with rough terrain. The location wasn't far from civilization, maybe an hour outside Richmond, but remote enough to feel like the middle of nowhere. The training ground was a sprawling mix of forest and farmland, bordered by a creek that fed into a marshy area. Locals called it the Blackwater Swamp, an old name from back when the area was full of plantations. Not the kind of place Aaron would think twice about. It was late afternoon when Aaron's squad was broken up into pairs to cover more ground. He got stuck with Novak, a new guy, quiet but competent. They were assigned a section near the edge of the swamp, a rough patch of woods that hadn't been logged in decades. Novak wasn't much of a talker, and Aaron didn't mind. It let him focus on the task at hand. The air was humid, sticky in that way Virginia gets in early fall. The two of them decided to split up to cover more ground. They were supposed to meet back in an hour by the creek. Aaron took his section, moving carefully through the undergrowth, mapping out the landmarks and following the contour lines on the map. It was slow going with the ground uneven and roots everywhere. It was about half an hour into it when things started to get strange. First, there was the smell. He couldn't quite place it, metallic and earthy, like rust mixed with wet moss. It wasn't strong, but it was there, hanging in the air like a thick fog. Aaron figured it was just swamp gases or some decaying animal nearby. The swamp was full of that kind of stuff. Then he caught sight of something ahead, moving fast between the trees. At first, he thought it might have been a wild pig, common enough in the area, but it didn't move like one. It was quicker and lower to the ground, almost slithering. Aaron hesitated, narrowing his eyes to get a better look, but the thing was already gone, disappearing into the thick brush. No big deal. He was out in the woods after all. But then he saw it again, moving in the opposite direction this time, as if it was circling him. The shape was more defined now, and he could see that it was hunched over, with a strange loping gait. It didn't make sense. Aaron felt his heartbeat kick up a notch, but he wasn't scared. Not yet. Instead, something else kicked in. Curiosity, maybe, or the desire to get a handle on whatever it was. He wasn't about to let something slip away without figuring out what the hell he was dealing with. He took a breath, adjusted his grip on the rifle slung across his back, and started moving toward it. Quickly, but not recklessly. He followed the direction the creature had gone, his eyes scanning the trees ahead. The underbrush was thick, and he had to fight his way through it. Every now and then, he'd catch a glimpse of the thing ahead of him, always just out of reach, always moving faster than he expected. It was leading him somewhere, that much was clear. Then he heard it, branches breaking, like something heavy was moving through the brush. He could see the treetops shifting, and it wasn't far. Aaron's pulse quickened as he dropped low, readying himself. He was close now, close enough that the smell was stronger. That same metallic tang mixed with the wet, earthy stench of the swamp. And then he saw it clearly for the first time. It was crouched at the edge of a clearing, maybe 30 yards ahead, partially hidden by the undergrowth. The thing was large, and its skin was dark, mottled, like wet tree bark. Its limbs were long, unnaturally so, ending in thick clawed fingers that dug into the ground. But it was what passed for a face that made Aaron stop in his tracks. It didn't have eyes, not like a human or animal. Instead, two dark pits, like hollowed-out sockets, stared in his direction. The mouth, if you could call it that, was a wide slit, dripping with something dark and viscous. Aaron's gut reaction was a mix of adrenaline and instinct. Whatever this thing was, it was dangerous, and he wasn't about to let it get away. He didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, moving fast, rifle in hand, ready to engage. He wasn't thinking about capturing it in the traditional sense. He just wanted to pin it down, corner it, figure out what it was. As he closed the distance, the creature turned, moving faster than he expected, its limbs propelling it through the underbrush with an eerie, fluid motion. Aaron cursed under his breath and sprinted after it, weaving through the trees. His boots slipped on the damp ground, but he kept going, pushing himself harder. The thing was heading toward the swamp, deeper into the thickest part of the forest, where the terrain turned to marsh. Aaron closed in, the creature's form just ahead of him. He was close enough now to make out more details. The way its limbs moved, too fast and too agile for something that size. The metallic smell was stronger now, almost suffocating. Just as he thought he had it cornered, the creature spun around. It stood up, taller than he'd realized, towering over him now. Aaron felt a rush of instinctive dread, but pushed it aside. He wasn't about to back down. He raised his rifle, ready to fire, but the creature was faster. It lunged, knocking him off balance, its claws slashing through the air. Aaron hit the ground hard, his rifle slipping from his grasp. He scrambled to his feet, reaching for his sidearm, but the creature didn't attack again. Instead, it stood there staring at him with those hollow pits where eyes should have been. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it turned and disappeared into the swamp, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something its size. Aaron stood there breathing heavily, his heart pounding. His mind raced to process what had just happened. He looked down at his hands still shaking, then back at the spot where the creature had vanished. There was no way he could follow it now. Not into the swamp, not with the light fading and the ground turning to mud. When he finally made it back to the creek, Novak was waiting for him. "You all right? You look like you've seen a ghost," Novak said, frowning as he noticed Aaron's disheveled state. Aaron wiped the sweat from his forehead and nodded. Something like that. They didn't talk much on the hike back to camp. Whatever that thing was, he hadn't caught it, hadn't even come close, but he knew it was out there, somewhere in the swamp, and he had to figure out what to do about it. But for now, he planned to just keep his mouth shut and continue on with his responsibilities. What do you think Aaron saw that day? I used to live in this quiet little suburb right outside of Milwaukee, in one of those neighborhoods where every house looks the same and people wave at you from their lawns. It was quiet, predictable, and felt safe. That's part of why I picked it. Rent was cheap, it was close to work. It was early spring, probably mid-April about 10 years ago, and the days were starting to get longer, but the nights were still cold enough that I needed a jacket. I remember the night clearly because I had just gotten back from a late shift at the diner where I worked. It was just after midnight when I pulled into my driveway. The street was dead quiet, as usual. My house was at the very end of a cul-de-sac. Behind it, there was a small patch of woods, just a few acres of trees between the neighborhood and the highway. Nothing special. Kids would sometimes play back there, and once in a while, you'd see some teenagers sneaking in to drink or smoke. I never thought much about it though. Just trees, right? Anyway, I parked the car, turned off the engine, and sat there for a minute. You know that feeling when you're too tired to even get out of the car. That was me, scrolling through my phone, taking a moment before heading inside, just decompressing. The air had that damp, heavy feeling, like it was about to rain. It was peaceful, at least for a few seconds. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just an animal rummaging around. We had a lot of them in the area, and they'd knock over garbage cans from time to time. But this sound was deeper, more drawn out, almost like a low moan coming from somewhere behind the house, near the edge of the woods. I almost thought someone was hurt back there. I looked into the rearview mirror, but I couldn't see much beyond the faint glow of my porch light. The woods were just a dark mass in the distance. The sound stopped for a second, and I sat there thinking maybe it was nothing. But then it came again, and louder. There was something unsettling about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't want to stick around to figure out what it was. I grabbed my bag, got out of the car, and headed for the front door, my keys in hand. The wind picked up, and I could hear the trees swaying behind me. The noise from the woods was gone, but the quiet was worse. I hurried inside, locked the door, and flipped on the light. From the entryway, I had a clear view of the back of the house, where the sliding glass door led to the small yard and those woods. For some reason, I found myself walking straight to that door. The blinds were half open, and through the gap I could see something moving just at the tree line. At first, it was hard to make out, just a shape shifting between the trunks. It looked big though, way too big to be a dog or even a person. It moved in this weird, uneven way, like it was injured or maybe just not used to walking upright. The way it hunched over made it look taller than a person. Taller than me for sure, and I'm not exactly short. Whatever it was, it seemed to stop when it reached the edge of the yard, almost like it was deciding whether to come closer. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the glass. There was something about the way it moved that didn't seem right. Its body was covered in something dark, something like mud. Its skin looked rough, almost patchy in places. But the worst part was its head that was misshapen, too large for its body, and its eyes were wide open, almost blank, like they weren't really looking at anything at all. I stood there staring at it. It didn't move any closer, just stayed right at the edge of the yard, swaying slightly, like it was unsure of itself. I felt this strange pull, like I should do something, but I couldn't decide what. Call for help? Turn off the lights and hope it went away? My feet wouldn't move. Then I watched in shock as the thing turned and disappeared back into the trees. It didn't run, just slowly walked away, vanishing into the shadows of the woods. I blinked my eyes thinking they weren't seeing properly, but they were. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every little sound outside had me on edge. Every creak of the house or rustle of the wind making me wonder if it had come back. When the sun finally came up, I felt some relief, but not much. The daylight didn't make what I saw feel any less real. The next day, I mentioned it to a couple of friends, just casually, like I wasn't even sure what I'd seen. One of my neighbors, Eric, who lived a couple houses down, got real quiet when I talked about it. He said he'd heard strange sounds coming from the woods before, but always figured it was just animals. But the way he said it made me think he'd seen something too, or at least had his own experience he wasn't talking about. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. Every time I came home late from work, I'd park as close to the front door as possible and rush inside. I'd still look out the back window sometimes, half expecting to see that figure again, but I never did. I'd hear things at night sometimes, strange noises coming from the woods, but I never saw it again. A few months later, I moved out. It wasn't because of that night exactly, but part of me was glad to leave those woods behind. Still, every once in a while, I drive past that old house, and I think about what I saw. I haven't gone back into those woods, and I don't plan to. Whatever was out there that night, I figure it's best left alone. It was a regular Wednesday afternoon, and Donnie found himself at the laundromat, of all places. His washing machine had broken down a few days before, so there he was, waiting for his clothes to dry. The place was mostly empty, just him, the lady working the counter, and some guy a couple of rows over folding a mountain of towels. The air smelled faintly of detergent, and the only sounds were the hum of the machines and the occasional click of zippers tumbling around in the dryers. It was mid-October, about 2 in the afternoon, with heavy gray clouds hanging overhead. The sky looked like it was threatening rain, but hadn't quite made up its mind yet. The streets outside were quiet, just a couple of parked cars and no one walking by. Donnie was scrolling through his phone, trying to pass the time, when something outside the window caught his eye. At first, it didn't register as anything out of the ordinary, just a dark shape moving along the edge of the glass. He assumed it was a shadow or a bird, but then, as he glanced up, he saw it again. It wasn't a shadow. It was something moving quickly, but low to the ground, like it was trying not to be noticed. He stared through the window, but whatever it was had disappeared around the corner. For a second, he thought maybe it was a stray dog or someone rushing past, but it didn't move like either of those. He shrugged it off. telling himself he must have imagined it. The clouds outside were thick, and the light was strange. Everything had that dim, muted look, like right before a storm hits. A few minutes passed, and Donnie went back to his phone. But then there it was again, another flicker of movement, this time clearer. Something big, pale, moving unnaturally fast across the street. It was hard to make out details through the fogged-up glass, but it seemed to be on all fours, its limbs long and awkward, almost too thin. He blinked, trying to get a better look, but by the time he focused, it was gone again. Donnie stood up from his chair and walked over to the window, leaning in close. He scanned the street, but everything was still. No cars, no people, just the empty stretch of sidewalk. He looked back toward the guy folding clothes, but he was gone too, like he'd vanished without a sound. The laundromat felt quieter now, more still, like even the air inside had changed somehow. The hum of the machine seemed distant, and the fluorescent lights above flickered just a bit. For a while, Donnie just stood there, staring out the window, waiting for something else to happen. He didn't know what exactly, but the whole situation felt off. That's when he saw it again, this time standing just across the street, under the overhang of a building. It wasn't a dog, and it sure as hell wasn't a person. It was hunched over, almost folded in on itself, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale, nearly gray, and its eyes, huge and glassy, stared straight ahead, though it didn't seem to be focused on anything. The thing had an odd, jerking movement, like it wasn't used to the way its body worked, and it seemed uncomfortable in its own skin. Donnie couldn't move, couldn't even think about what he should do next. The thing across the street shifted its weight and tilted its head slightly, as though it had sensed him watching from the laundromat, but it didn't make a move toward him, not yet. He took a step back from the window, trying to wrap his mind around what he was seeing. It didn't make any sense, but there it was, just standing there in the open, like it had every right to be there. For a moment, he wondered if it was some kind of weird art installation or a prank, but nothing about it felt staged. The thing's head snapped in his direction then, and it stared right at him. Its eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto his, and Donnie felt an odd pressure, like he was suddenly being dragged into its gaze. He took another step back, heart hammering in his chest, but the creature mimicked his movement, shuffling forward slightly on those long limbs. Panic started to creep in, but Donnie still couldn't make himself move. He felt trapped, like the thing had him pinned in place with its stare. Then slowly, it began to creep closer, moving across the street toward the laundromat in an unsteady, deliberate way. It wasn't rushing, but there was a tension in the way it moved, like it was just waiting for the right moment to lunge. Donnie snapped out of his daze. He grabbed his laundry, still damp, and bolted for the door. He didn't stop to check if the thing was following him or if anyone else had noticed it. He just ran. As soon as he was outside, he half expected to see it right behind him, but the street was empty again. No sign of it anywhere. Just cars, wet pavement, and the thick dark clouds overhead. He didn't waste any more time. He jumped into his car, threw the laundry into the passenger seat, and took off. He couldn't explain it, but something about the way the whole thing had happened stuck with him. It was like the creature had been there 1 minute and then vanished into thin air the next, like it could slip in and out of sight whenever it wanted. For a few days after, Donnie tried to rationalize it. He thought maybe he'd just been tired or stressed and had imagined the whole thing. But every time he replayed it in his mind, the details came back just as clear. The pale skin, the unnatural way it moved, the way it had looked at him like it knew something he didn't. He kept going over it in his head, trying to find a reasonable explanation, but none of it added up. Eventually, he told his buddy Mark about it over beers, hoping for some perspective. Mark laughed it off, said it was probably just some animal or maybe a homeless guy trying to scare people off. But deep down, Donnie knew that wasn't what he'd seen. To this day, Donnie still finds himself driving by that laundromat sometimes, even though he doesn't need to go there anymore. His washer at home is fixed, But every now and then, he feels this strange pull to go back. He never saw the thing again, but every time he walks past that window, he can't help but look outside, half expecting to catch a glimpse of that pale figure standing just beyond the glass, waiting.